It is one of the best-selling books of all time. It often comes top of reader polls as the best work of fiction ever written. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings has been translated into 30 different languages and sells in more than 80 countries. Such success has inevitably produced a small battalion of academics speculating as to the meaning of the book and the motives of its author. To some, The Lord of the Rings is an allegory of the Second World War, a triumph of good over evil. To others, it is a lament for the rural shires of England, lost to urbanization and industrialization in the 1930s. Left-wing critics have argued that the book champions the ideals of collectivism, while some on the extreme right have viewed the novel as an endorsement of white supremacy. Happily for many readers, Tolkien had little time for the theories. Writing in the foreword to the second edition, published in 1966, Tolkien states that he cordially dislikes allegory and warns the reader not to look for any broader meaning to the story. First and foremost, he writes, he is a tale-teller, an historian writing a made-up history. But if the story is purely the product of imagination, what of the landscapes on which that story is played out? For many, Middle-earth is the real triumph of Tolkien's work, a living, breathing, even thinking domain that gives readers the uncanny feeling that they have trod this land before. Was there a Shire to inspire the Shire? Did Tolkien tread the real dead marshes? Here the author does provide some direct evidence. The other clues can be pieced together from the places and events of his life. So, where better to begin the search for the real Middle-earth than where Frodo and Bilbo before him started their journey? The Shire.
There are physical resemblances to English rural landscape with small villages, hills, woods, but not necessarily forests. He had family connections with Worcestershire that he valued highly. He loved the West Midlands, Oxfordshire, Berkshire countryside, which he saw as vanishing. And this all went into the making of the Shire.
And what better way of making these landscapes feel like England than the borrowing of English-sounding place names?
The vast majority of the place names in the Shire are very much English place names. A lot of them are place names that actually exist, and of those that don't exist, they're made up of fairly common English place name elements that he was using creatively in his own way to make up names that he liked the sound of. But the Shire, I mean, he said himself that the Shire was very much based on England, so he uses place names which are based on Old English, and in some cases place names from round Evesham where his mother's family came from.
And in this English countryside, amid the resonant place names, all that's missing are the English themselves. Or perhaps not.
The hobbits, there are people who are very down to earth, stoic, faintly laughable. You can't imagine them doing anything particularly serious. And Rupert Brooke, the First World War poet, described with great frustration his countrymen as being half men, reduced by a life of leisure and growing luxury.
This concern for Englishness was shared by one of Tolkien's contemporaries, a writer who would also go on to imagine a fully thought-out alternative world.
George Orwell was also very concerned with what it meant to be English, and he referred to the English people as this peculiar mixture of democracy and privilege, honesty and humbug, and so on. And actually Tolkien had very much similar interests and concerns. Tolkien approached the whole question from a conservative point of view with a small c, and Orwell from a socialist, but their concerns and their fears were very much very closely related.
All of this begs a question. How can books so firmly rooted in England's past continue to strike sparks in imaginations all over the world?
What Tolkien is giving readers to some extent is an England in the form of the Shire that is idealized, that is the self-image, but that also refers to certain real values to do with being rooted in a particular place, not living a completely mechanized, industrialized life, being in touch with certain natural realities to do with the natural world and ultimately ecology, without being completely dominated by them. Many of Tolkien's readers from all over the world, Russia, Ireland, Finland, Italy, Africa, I discovered that they don't necessarily see the Shire as English, which I was very, very surprised to find. But what seems to happen is that readers identify the Shire and small, simple, probably rural people, small equating with kind of unimportant in the grand scheme of things, with their own equivalents, their own cultural equivalents and traditions. So it didn't even occur to many of these people that the Shire was particularly English. I think the idea of home is terribly important in Tolkien's work, and being at home, feeling at home, homesickness. After all, the subtitle for The Hobbit was There and Back Again.
There's a problem for everybody though these days if you want to find the real Shire. It's been sort of built over or cut down. At one point when Fellowship of the Ring came out, I was asked in a radio interview, why aren't they filming it in Britain? Well, it's quite simple, because you can't get any place in Britain that's matching the descriptions, which doesn't have a major road or is under an airport's flight path, which is a problem.
Nevertheless, the Shire remains a place in which modern readers feel very much at home.
The book starts off with things like a birthday party. And who doesn't have birthday parties? You know, we all do. It's a very good connection. Likewise, as we're sat here in a pub having a drink and a chat, that's one of the other aspects of the book. You start off talking about birthday parties with a group of people sat in a pub, as Tolkien and his friends would do as well. They'd regularly meet up in pubs in Oxford, the Lamb and Flag or the Bird and Baby, and they'd drink and chat in C.S. Lewis's rooms. So he liked to drop, that's obvious. And that ties in with the hobbits and their drinking songs. So you get these connections that draw you in landscape and in just the sheer social life of the hobbits. So finding the Shire, it's around you. You just need to know where to look and how to look, perhaps.
The industrial West Midlands of England may seem an unlikely place to start, but it is here, over a century ago, that the seeds of Tolkien's Middle-earth were sown.
Although J.R.R. Tolkien was born in South Africa, both of his parents came from Birmingham, and he returned when he was 3 years old with his mother and younger brother for what was meant to be just a family visit. But in fact it turned out tragically to be a permanent move, because while they were away, his father Arthur died back in South Africa, and so they were forced to set up home permanently in Birmingham. They didn't have a lot of money, and so they found a small cottage in the tiny hamlet of Sarehole, which was then in Worcestershire and not part of the city of Birmingham. Most importantly for Tolkien's development, it gave him access to a beautiful part of the Worcestershire countryside where he could play and to a certain extent trespass on the farmers' lands. And we're standing here at Sarehole Mill, which is one of the most influential of the places from that period of Tolkien's childhood. And we're probably standing as near to it as Tolkien himself would have got, because of course it was a working mill in those days.
It is surely more than coincidence that a mill should be present in the Shire, just around the corner from Bilbo and Frodo's home, Bag End. And Ronald, as Tolkien was then known, along with his brother Hilary, was inspired by the mill's inhabitants too.
They would go up to the mill and creep around the outside and look through the gates, and the miller would come and chase them away. And he was covered in white, he was dressed in white. We'd think of it nowadays as being flour, but it wasn't. They were actually grinding bone meal at the mill in those days.
And so he was given the nickname of the White Ogre.
And not very far away was a farmer who had mushroom fields, or fields with mushrooms in them. I don't think he grew them commercially. And they'd go and try and nick his mushrooms, and he'd chase them away, and they called him the Black Ogre.
The Black Ogre can be seen in the shape of Farmer Maggot, who gives shelter to Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin in the Fellowship of the Ring, and who once chased a young Frodo from his fields for stealing mushrooms. The expansion of Birmingham means a child growing up in Sarehole now has precious little opportunity to get up to that sort of mischief.
The rural Worcestershire that Tolkien knew as a child around Sarehole and Hall Green has mostly now been swallowed up by the growth of the city of Birmingham. But one magical trace remains in the green belt that is the Coal Valley, running through the Sarehole area, along which Tolkien would have played and explored as a child.
There was a real danger that Birmingham would swallow up the Coal Valley, but campaigners have succeeded in preserving this echo of the Shire.
This landscape and Tolkien actually came together, and it is rather nice to think that this little bit of intimate little river that most everybody everywhere else in the country forgets about, doesn't even know about, could actually end up being part of the influence on novels which had such an impact on people worldwide.
As a grown man, Tolkien would no doubt have found much to admire in Peter's hobbit-like concern for his immediate surroundings. Yet, despite the conservation work, it still requires a bit of imagination to turn back the years to before the Shire was born. The Tolkiens left here for the smoke and noise of Birmingham when Ronald was just 8, but he once described his time at Sarehole as the most formative part of my life. The Shire did not grow out of Sarehole alone, but from a wide expanse of England, which before the Norman conquest of 1066 was the Saxon kingdom of Mercia. Tolkien spent most of his life here, and was a self-proclaimed Mercian who lamented the Normans' brutal suppression of Anglo-Saxon culture. As a 17-year-old, he introduced a motion to his school's debating society, arguing that this house deplores the occurrence of the Norman conquest. But those strong Anglo-Saxon influences can be seen in Rohan's hardy, warrior-like people. The Shire grew out of something cozier and a good deal less distant. It came out of the villages and countryside of Tolkien's modern-day Mercian home. Tolkien said, perhaps mischievously, that Hobbiton was nothing more than a Warwickshire village at the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, 1897. But the Shire is a good deal more complex than that.
If you go to the west of the Shire, you find an area called West March. March means a borderland, as in the Welsh Marches of Britain. March is also very much the same name as Mercia, the old Middle Kingdom, which was very much his personal and linguistic homeland. And this is a curious thing. The landscape there is not a Welsh landscape. The downs there are called the White Downs, and you find White Downs not on the Welsh borders, but south of where he lived, down in Berkshire, and indeed down in Kent and Sussex, where his brother lived in Sussex for a long time. So he's taken one part of the English landscape, which he was very fond of, and moved it to another part of the map that he was also very fond of, and he's combined the two.
This subtle combining of real places with a deep understanding of language, and especially place names, is common throughout the Shire, and indeed Middle-earth. It is a writing technique that at first glance appears to evade simple links between real and imaginary places. Yet such links can be made, as revealed by a visit to a tiny Worcestershire hamlet called Dormston. Here, at the end of an unremarkable track, is a farm where Tolkien's Aunt Jane lived in the 1920s. Today, it's called Dormston Manor. But maps from the time reveal another, more significant name. It is a perfect example of Tolkien's love of place names and the Mercian countryside coming together. And it no doubt appealed to Tolkien as a linguist joke, Bag End being the literal translation of the French cul-de-sac. Further south, the well-stocked fields of the Vale of Evesham provided more stimulation for Tolkien's equally fertile imagination. It was also the ancestral home of the Suffields, his mother's family. Though a Tolkien by name, he considered himself a Suffield by tastes, talents, and upbringing. As he also described himself as a hobbit in all but size, it is surely not a leap too far to see a good deal of the Shire in this corner of rural Worcestershire. And when Tolkien loved an area, he seemed to love the place names too.
For instance, he has one village called Frogmorton, near where his mother's family used to live in the Vale of Evesham, a village called Throckmorton. And this again is a settlement in a marsh, moor. But the Throck, of course, is nothing to do with frogs at all. It would have been one of the local residents, perhaps back prior to 1066. So he's there taken a town with a personal name in it, removed the personal name and put in a local feature.
A nearby village might also have suggested the alias Underhill, used by the Shire's most sought-after inhabitant, Frodo Baggins. Though in interviews and letters Tolkien often referred to the West Midlands of England as his home, it was the university city of Oxford where he spent most of his life.
Tolkien and Oxford are intimately linked. He came here as a student in the 1910s, sort of studied here until he joined the army for the First World War, came back, worked on the dictionary, that's what's become the Oxford English Dictionary, but which at the time was the New English Dictionary, taught for something like almost 40 years, changed college from one professorial post as Professor of Anglo-Saxon to Professor of English and Literature. And while he was here, wrote some of his most famous works, both academically and, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, the novels everybody loves.
However, though Hobbiton occupies roughly the same latitude and longitude on the map of Middle-earth as Oxford does on our own map, it was to the surrounding countryside that Tolkien turned as the Shire continued to take shape in his imagination. Tolkien would take frequent trips to nearby villages with Shire-sounding names, like Charlton-on-Otmore, Wormingford and Brill. It was here that connections could be made to country life, connections that he feared were being broken and lost forever as the 20th century progressed. And these small communities were fresh in his mind as he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in his suburban Oxford home. It is clear that the villages and people of the former kingdom of Mercia had a profound effect on Tolkien's imagination. But there may be at least one other part of rural England that influenced the Shire.
Stonyhurst College is a Catholic boarding and day school. It's been in Lancashire for 200 years, but it actually started life 400 years ago in northern France. In those days, a Catholic education wasn't possible in England. Professor Tolkien would have known about the school even before he came here to visit, because it was one of the most important Catholic schools in England. His actual reason for visiting was because his son John was training for the priesthood in Rome in the late 1930s, early 1940s at the English College. And when Italy entered the Second World War, obviously the English College couldn't stay in Rome, and so they were evacuated and were looking for a home. And Professor Tolkien would have come up, mostly in the summer, to visit his son John, and obviously liked the place, because even after John had gone back to Rome to finish his studies, Professor Tolkien continued coming up and spending summers here. There's a tradition in the school that he wrote part of The Lord of the Rings in what is now the boys' library. And we certainly know that he wrote while he was staying in the guest house, the college guest house, because of the family have said, we must be quiet, Professor Tolkien's writing upstairs. He came here mostly for summer holidays, and I imagine he would have taken full advantage of the countryside. He loved the countryside, and there's some very beautiful countryside around us.
Many readers will recall the Shire when looking out across this landscape. But where is the evidence that this part of England actually helped shape The Lord of the Rings?
The Sherborne family, who owned Stonyhurst College between the 14th and 18th century, perhaps was an influence to J.R.R. Tolkien when marking out his map of Middle-earth and including a river called the River Sherborne. Also, if one looks at the three rivers that Tolkien included in his map of Middle-earth, the River Sherborne, the River Brandywine, and also the River Withywindle, the confluences of those three rivers do follow very closely the confluences of the three rivers that run through the Ribble Valley, the Hodder, the Ribble, and the Calder. Down where the River Calder meets the River Ribble, if we were to go back to the 1950s and back further than that, when Tolkien was visiting Stonyhurst College, you would have found a passenger ferry that crossed the River Ribble opposite Hacking Hall. Now, of course, in the book, Frodo escapes from the ring race, a black rider, on a passenger ferry. Also, if one looks again at the pastel sketch that J.R.R. Tolkien gave to the family running this guest house behind me as a thank you present, the sketch of the kitchen garden at the back with the very vibrant colour of the bean plants, that is reflected in chapter 7 of The Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo throws open the curtains of Tom Bombadil's house, his view slightly obscured by a tall line of bean plants.
As peaceful as it is today, this part of Lancashire has a troubled history. It was here that one of England's most savage witch hunts took place. To this day, on Halloween, local people walk to the top of Pendle Hill, symbolically reclaiming it from Satan. As a regular visitor, Tolkien must have been aware of this. Perhaps Pendle's mist-laden peak is an evocation of the dark and brooding places that lie just beyond the Shire's borders.
Stonyhurst College's claim is interesting because they have some landscape connections, but that does tend to ignore the fact that Tolkien was brought up in Warwickshire and Worcestershire, studied in Oxfordshire, had a first sort of professional job in Yorkshire, and then came back to Oxfordshire for the rest of his life. In fact, the only shire he wasn't in when he went to Bournemouth. And that's Dorset, but then again it's Dorsetshire. So I'd say their claim is fairly tenuous.
Whether Tolkien simply saw in the Ribble Valley reflections of his Middle-earth, or was directly influenced by the area, remains the stuff of debate. The Shire is a landscape of the mind that does more, much more than simply gather together memories of vanishing villages and countryside. The Shire embraces and celebrates some universal values.
I think what has appealed to readers from all over the world about the Hobbits is the characteristics that make them so different from the elites that they're all familiar with. The powerful professional, political, economic elites that are clearly running the show. The hobbits, by contrast, are rather simple, even stupid. They've been rather left behind. They're not in a position to rule the world. Actually, they have absolutely no interest in ruling the world. They just want to get on with their own little lives. Well, that actually applies probably to the vast majority of people on the planet. So it's not too hard to see why they would find hobbits, in this sense, easy to understand.
When Frodo is compelled to leave the Shire for reasons beyond his control, we are reminded that the outside world cannot be shut out forever, that the landscapes beyond our vision and what goes on there cannot be ignored. If much of the Shire can be traced to a bygone rural England, what shaped the rest of Middle-earth? In part, the answer can be found in Tolkien's lifelong love of language.
Tolkien loved words of every sort, particularly names which had beautiful and mysterious sounds to them. He started making up little bits of his own language when he was really quite young with his young cousins. And he said in later life that this was something which a lot of children do, but most of them drop it, and he went on doing it, as we know, all his life. The sound of the words conjured up images in his mind, and of course he became a writer of fairy stories, so the images that they conjured up in his mind were not the images of the everyday world outside, but places that you would only see in dreams or perhaps in a beautiful picture, but also perhaps the kind of scene that you might see by looking out of a window on the right sort of day and the right sort of light could be transformed into these fairy landscapes. He said himself that names come first and the story follows.
As in so many other respects, Tolkien was reverting to a very old and now unfashionable set of ideas and values, and one of them with respect to language was that there is some sort of meaningful connection between a thing or a place and its name, that the connection isn't completely arbitrary, so that he went to great lengths to try to ensure that people, places and things had the names in the various languages of Middle-earth that were appropriate for them.
Not only did Tolkien appropriate real places for their names, he formed stories around these names.
After the Tolkiens were married, they also stayed at a village called Great Haywood. When you come to the Lord of the Rings, in the early stages, when the hobbits are trying to escape from the Shire, pursued by the evil Nazgul, they stay in a house in a place called Crickhollow. And just over the border from Crickhollow is the Old Forest. The trees were both sentient and they were rather hostile. And they came out and they attacked the local hobbit settlement some generations before Frodo Baggins was alive. And the hobbits went and they attacked the trees in their return. They cut down some of the trees and they built this hedge. They planted a hedge, and the hedge grew very, very large, and it was the boundary between the hobbit country, the settlement, and the wild wood. And this was the Great Hedge, or the Great Hay. And in fact, there's this village in the Shire called Hayes End. And so you've got the Great Hay and you've got the wood. He remembered this name, and this contained within it an idea, a very, very dynamic idea of the relationship between the big hedge and the wood, and why it's a boundary. Why do they have to keep the trees out? Because the trees are hostile.
As you journey from the Shire, fewer and fewer of Middle-earth's place names have their roots in English. Instead, they are increasingly derived from Tolkien's invented Elvish. Elvish, in turn, draws on the languages of two very different European countries, Wales and Finland.
He started writing Quenya, the first one that he began to invent, after he discovered Finnish. He was not a great scholar of Finnish or a fluent reader, but he worked with the Finnish text for a bit because he wanted to know and understand more about this language whose look and feel, whose sound and tradition really appealed to him. It's difficult to see, unless you're a linguist, exactly how this comes out in it, but I could just point out one example. There's a word for horse in Quenya, which is Rocco, which has 2 Ks in it. And if you go and have a look at Finnish names and the Finnish language, you'll find an awful lot of words have 2 Ks in them. And this is just one little reflection. The other language, the other Elvish language that he wrote, Sindarin, had a certain amount of the feel of Welsh in it. He was extremely fond of Welsh. There are some elements in it, for instance, Wen, which means a young woman. You see this in the name of Arwen, Aragorn's wife. That's also a word which appears in a great many Welsh personal names. It doesn't mean a young woman in Welsh personal names. It means white, as in Bronwyn, which I think means the white-breasted lady, which is very beautiful in itself. And he built some of this into his Sindarin. And the relationship between the 2 languages, which he spent most of his life playing with, was that the sound shifts between the one and the other reflected what might have happened had the Finnish language gradually mutated into the Welsh language over thousands of years. And this was his philology, and this is what he really enjoyed.
Philology, the science of language, enabled Tolkien to imagine finely detailed cultures. His invented history is peopled by great heroes and villains, encompasses epic stories, and roams across fantastic landscapes.
The places he'd seen provided the cues and the images and the memories which he could connect to the words that really appealed to him, that he found beautiful, and create out of that a landscape and peoples and actions. And this was what was most important to him.
Of all these cues, the horrors that he endured on the killing fields of the Somme had the greatest impact on Tolkien as a man and Tolkien as a writer.
I think it's got to be wondered whether Tolkien would actually have written anything if the Great War hadn't happened. Impossible to prove, but he began seriously writing poetry very soon after the outbreak of war, and it was his friends' sense of the fact that it was possible to die in this war that prompted them to urge him to write for publication. So in a very practical sense, the Great War gave us Tolkien's works. It's very telling that before he went out to fight in the Somme, Tolkien had developed his idea of the elves, his invented languages, but when he returned from the Somme, he fitted these pre-existing elements into what was suddenly an epic about the conflict between good and evil.
The First World War did not just provide the impetus to write, it provided solid locations too.
The Dead Marshes were the only place where Tolkien actually says, this showed the influence of my experience in the First World War. It's a rank, poisonous marsh in which the phantoms of the corpses of those who died in battle long ago are part buried. And clearly it evokes what the soldier saw on the Somme. In the book, it's dreamlike. On the Somme, it was if you like, nightmarish, but nevertheless real. That you could see faces staring up at you from pools in the mud. Mount Doom itself, in a very telling passage in The Lord of the Rings, is described as if it's a great throbbing engine. It's part of Sauron, the Dark Lord's machinery. So in a sense, it's a sort of artillery piece in its own right. That seems to me to be, on one hand, a symbolic, and on the other hand, a realistic representation of lived memory. And there are other aspects to Mordor which only make sense, really, if you refer them back to Tolkien's experiences on the Somme. the air is bitter and acrid. The water is described as bitter and oily.
It is worth recalling that the Shire is remarkably close to the Grey Havens, the port from which Frodo and the elves depart on their journey from the mortal world. In other words, the land of the dead is worryingly close by.
In the First World War, soldiers were deeply conscious of how close the trenches of northern France and Flanders were to the home counties, to London and to the south coast. You could hear the guns from Kent.
Looking back, the impact of the First World War on Tolkien seems obvious. Yet in the years immediately after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, the connection was all but ignored by critics and readers.
After The Lord of the Rings was published, critics, of course, were very confused. This was a new kind of story, so they tried to connect it with the most recent major world events. It came out in 1954, 1955, and the Second World War was in the very recent past. Tolkien pointed out that the First World War had been just as traumatic an experience for young men of his generation.
Tolkien's response to World War I was profoundly different to that of other soldier poets.
Tolkien says something very paradoxical on the face of it, which is that it was in the Great War that his taste for fairy stories was awakened. This seems paradoxical because it was this war in particular that created what has become known as disenchantment in literature. It made most soldiers question the values of the society that had brought them to that extreme. Values such as heroism, majesty, power, honour. Tolkien turned to fairy story at this time because fairy story is about the encounters of brave people with danger and their transformation by danger.
In this manner, Tolkien was able to use the general conventions of the fairy story to achieve something much more specific.
When Tolkien started out devising his mythology, which was during the First World War, his idea was to develop a mythology for England. So he actually created very consciously connections between his fictional places and places in Britain that mattered to him personally. For example, Warwick, where his fiancée Edith lived, became the capital of the Lonely Isle, as it was called, Cortirion, and Oxford took its place as Taroctana.
Other aspects of Middle-earth hark back to a past more distant than the one that had helped give shape to the Shire. A trio of influential sites can be found to the southwest of Oxford.
In Berkshire, there's the White Horse on the hill at Uffington. That's a famous sort of chalk carving in the hillside. And in Lord of the Rings Two Towers, we come across the people of Rohan, who live on a rolling grassy plain that sort of runs into hills and in mountains. And the symbol of the king's house is a white horse on a green background. So obviously that was a link to Tolkien's stories in some respect. And I think actually Christopher Tolkien mentions it either as an aside in the biography or in the Tolkien family album, that him and his father would cycle out there sometimes. With Vail Smithy, apart from the Anglo-Saxon connection, is the fact it's a barrow. A stone entrance, very much like the descriptions you get of the Barrow Wights Mound in the Barrow Downs at the edge of the Old Forest, when Frodo and co are caught in the mist. The Ridgeway is one of the ancient trackways of Britain, one of the old straight roads. one of the places sort of created by sort of Iron Age man, going from A to B in a straight line as best as possible, keeping to the high ground. In Middle-earth, there's actually a couple of major roads, one of which crosses the other near Bree, where the hobbits are heading to at the start of Fellowship of the Ring. The north-south end of it is no longer in use because the North Kingdom's fallen. So that road, although once a major highway for travel back and forth, messengers, commerce, is now just grassed over. It's called the Greenway, in fact, by the people in Bree.
These sites are on the border of the old kingdom of Mercia. And if what Mercia became suggested the Shire, then the original Saxon Mercia suggested Rohan. The people of Rohan have been described as Saxons with horses, and there are recurring parallels between the peoples and places of Anglo-Saxon works like Beowulf and those of Rohan. Not surprisingly, Tolkien made this connection linguistically too.
People who read The Lord of the Rings will remember the country of Rohan, which plays a major part, particularly in the second book. But the name of that country is not actually Rohan. That's what it's called by its neighbours, the men of Gondor, and it means horseland. The inhabitants called it the Mark. That's the modern English version of it, and it means the border country. Rohan was very much on the borders of everything in Middle-earth. It was in fact slap in the middle, very much like the Midlands of Tolkien's own childhood. And the word is very much the same as the name of the county of Mercia, which was believed to have been Merc back in the days before this was recorded. This has been derived from slightly later forms and is effectively the same word.
To the west of Old Mercia is a site that hints not only at characters and places, but also at plot devices within The Lord of the Rings, including the most important one of all.
Back in 1929, a Romano-British temple at Glidney Park in the Forest of Dean was being excavated by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, and at that time he asked J.R.R.Tolkien to write an analysis of the name of one of the local gods, Nodens. And the hill there that was being excavated was known in Victorian times and earlier as Dwarf Hill, but it must have got him wondering what were the dwarfs doing with the hill. Among the artefacts they dug up were a number of very, very small tools, which are interpreted as being, naturally in our world, toy tools. And this was kind of evidence that there had been very small people around that area at some stage. So people do wonder if, when he started to create the story of The Hobbit, which was sometime between 1930 and 1936, if this was in the back of his mind, that there were little people living underneath the hill. Of course, the dwarfs and the Lonely Mountain in that story are a central part of it, and the hobbits themselves live underground. And another of the artefacts that was discovered from that area, it was a Romano-British inscription on a piece of lead, something that somebody would have left at the temple as a petition to the local god. And what this actually was doing was calling down a curse upon somebody who had stolen a golden ring. We wonders, my precious, what that made him think about. Of course, the tradition of the stolen ring and the dwarves, it's a very ancient one. You know, it didn't just happen here. It goes back to Old Norse literature, an Old Norse tradition, and Wagner used it, of course, in his ring cycle. But it very often takes more than one cue to get somebody's fertile mind thinking about what was happening.
To evoke the great buildings of Middle-earth, Tolkien was obliged to put Anglo-Saxon culture to one side. Instead, he looked closer to home, to Birmingham and Oxford, the cities that most shaped his life. At the age of 8, he had moved from Sarehole to Birmingham, where he attended a local Roman Catholic church, the Oratory.
Tolkien and his brother became altar servers at the Oratory, and every morning after Mass, as they stepped out of the church onto Pow and Harrow Road, they would have seen the tower behind me, the 19th century Waterworks Tower, and this tower, 18th century Perrott's Folly.
Though it is tempting to see in these towers the two towers of the second volume of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien never revealed to which two towers the title alludes. But it does not seem fanciful to suppose that to a small boy from a rural background, these twin structures would have left a lasting impression. Towers are of crucial importance to the Lord of the Rings. They are symbols of power, from Cirith Ungol in Mordor to Saruman's stronghold, Isengard, from the three elf towers close to the Grey Havens to Minas Tirith. The Shire is not noted for its towers, but then few hobbits lust for power, as the other peoples of Middle-earth do. While the Shire may not be renowned for its grand buildings, Oxford certainly is. Here Tolkien walked the streets of a city that would suggest one of the grandest places in Middle-earth, Minas Tirith.
In Return of the King, you have Legolas and Gimli walking through Minas Tirith, the great town of Gondor, the great city fortress almost. And although Legolas is none too keen, being a wood elf, he doesn't really like stone buildings, Gimli sat there looking around, walking along, going, there's some good buildings here. But there's a history there of interesting names and things carved over doors. And if you look around Oxford colleges, you'll find a lot of them have heraldic symbols carved over their entrances. There's a lot of them have got very interesting stonework. For instance, Exeter College, Tolkien's own undergraduate college, if you walk in there, a lot of it was remodelled in the sort of 18th, 19th century. But there's a couple of very old buildings dating from more like the 15th, 16th century. And the clash of stonework is interesting there, not just because it's pretty to look at, but it ties in quite nicely with some of the descriptions of Minas Tirith. The fact that obviously the city has grown and changed over the years. Buildings have been rebuilt, and remodelled, and fallen empty. Because especially if you walk around a college in the vacation, there's very few people there, so it suddenly becomes a bit of a ghost town. It seems very much like a Minas Tirith, but it's a patchworky thing. You have to be in the right sort of lane at the right time to get a shiver of, ooh, this could be Minas Tirith.
In Oxford, Tolkien found darkness alongside the grandeur.
Well, in Oxford, in the centre of Oxford, there's a large round building called the Radcliffe Camera. It sits in Radcliffe Square. It's part of the Bodleian Library, and of course Tolkien would have therefore gone past it regularly, even used it because it's mostly English and history books in there. And the forefathers of Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, the Dunedain who founded the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, came to Middle-earth fleeing the destruction of their country, Númenor, which is an island. It's an Atlantis myth. And the country was destroyed because of Sauron corrupting them and building a great temple to Morgoth, his Dark Master from the Silmarillion. And his temple is described as being round with a great silver dome which blackened over time with the smoke of sacrifices. So, you think about it, you're walking around Oxford, you look at this big round building with a big dome that's going black with smoke, in the 30s and 40s. It's an obvious concrete link.
Today, the Radcliffe Camera is clean. But in the stained building, almost tomb-like, he imagined a monument to the triumph of mechanism over nature, a triumph that had been writ large by World War I. For Tolkien, pollution and war on an industrial scale were aspects of the same destructive and reductive process.
I think the destruction that Tolkien witnessed on the Somme, the destruction of the natural world, which was just extravagantly awful. Whole woodlands being reduced to torn stumps, rolling downlands, chalk uplands of the kind that surround Oxford, torn up into wastelands of mud. That realisation of destruction made much more acute a feeling that Tolkien had from childhood that the natural world was a precious thing that was under attack from the callous human hand.
I think the conflict between industrialization and nature is very central to The Lord of the Rings. For example, it comes up in the differences which are made very sharply clear between Saruman and Treebeard. between what Saruman is doing at Isengard, right next to where the Ents live. Saruman is described as having a mind of metal and wheels. The ability, even more so, of Sauron to make large, extremely dangerous machines, explosions, the love of the orcs for explosions, etc. This is all laid out very starkly. I think Tolkien was a real anti-industrialist and even more broadly a real anti-modernist.
It was industrialization that had fueled the growth of Birmingham. And it is industrialization that has destroyed much of the landscape Tolkien loved.
This is a classic example of what Tolkien feared most, that his beloved Worcestershire countryside would be submerged by industry and urbanism. We're standing here at the entrance to one of his favourite haunts, Moseby Bog, yet now it's totally surrounded by a post-war housing estate.
Tolkien's attitude to industrialization has been seen by turns as reactionary and far-sighted.
I think he saw the dangers of industrialization actually pretty early, a long time before it became, ecology for example, became a widespread concern. So I think to give him credit, while he may have been one-sided, he was also right about a lot of things.
Much of Tolkien's ecological sensitivity was inspired by his acute feelings for trees.
Tolkien loved trees passionately, defended them all his life, and felt about them the way some people feel about animals, for example, or perhaps other people.
It was a relationship nurtured at a very early age by his walks along the Coal Valley and around nearby Moseby Bog.
When you walk into Moseby Bog, you realise how intimate and compact and pressing down on top of you it is. So if you imagine Tolkien walking into this, he had a totally different environment to that he experienced down the valley with the open fields and the long views. Here you had the trees coming on top of you, you probably had fallen trees, you had trees that were broken down, trees growing at peculiar angles. So again, he had a totally different concept to work with, and if you've got a fertile mind, as Tolkien clearly had, again you can see how the two came together to complement each other and help him to formulate his ideas of Middle-earth and the Shire.
These two places reveal how different neighbouring woods can be. It was a lesson not lost on Tolkien as he describes the forests of Middle-earth.
All the woods and forests in Middle-earth are different. That is something that's typical of Tolkien. It's all trees, it's all forests, but you cannot say therefore they're all the same. He allows for the individuality of each different wood, and indeed ultimately each different kind of tree. And of course the striking thing about the Ents is that they are not sort of anthropomorphic trees, they're trees that are sentient. While the natural world is worthy of reverence and respect, it also shouldn't be romanticized. They're not pretty, harmless things. They can be quite fatal. If you get lost in Mirkwood, if you wander off the path, you've pretty much had it. And the Old Forest obviously is a dangerous place. So he cannot be accused of over-romanticizing woods, I don't think. But he clearly loved trees. And he said in a letter towards the end of his life, in all my works I've taken the part of trees against all their enemies.
Middle-earth. A world projected by one mind, imaginary, and yet seemingly so solid. We will pore over its maps and consider the journeys made from one place to another. It is not our world, and yet we intimately recognize its cultures and conflicts.
People find they can connect their own memories of landscape with what Tolkien describes in his books. And his descriptions, they're detailed without being very, very specific in the way that could only apply to one place or one time. And they're romantic without, on the whole, being soppy. A lot of the story has quite a hard edge to it, and quite a lot of the landscapes are demanding and forbidding and dangerous. But certainly in Northern Europe, which was where he was living and writing, and even outside that, people find the landscapes strangely familiar, as if they'd been there before, and this really appeals to them.
He was a man who was very interested in the world around him. He had very strong political views. He wanted to effect change in the world. But his method of doing so was not by preaching or polemicising. It was by fiction or poetry, the literary means, the inspirational means, if you like.
There is this very integral, intimate connection between people and kinds of people and place in Tolkien's work. Something that, by living in large cities which more and more resemble each other interchangeably, I mean, look at the high streets in British cities and the shops there and so on, we're losing sight of this.
The quest to find the real Middle-earth has led us in the footsteps of its creator, J.R.R. Tolkien, to the places he frequented and loved, through the woodlands in which he played as a child, to the city where he studied his beloved languages and imagined and wrote, and to the no-man's land of the Somme. But Tolkien urged readers to apply their own experiences of people and places to the story. The Shire he imagined can't possibly be the same as yours or mine. It was Tolkien's great gift to take familiar places and to transform them into something unique and unforgettable. It allows us to see in the apparently ordinary places of our own lives something fantastic and worth cherishing.